Good morning. Now, just before recording here, Jonathan had introduced me. My name is Ken Campos. I'm a student of Theosophy here in the San Diego Lodge, and it's my pleasure to give a talk today called, let's see here, it's called Fohat Forces and Physics. Fohat Forces and Physics. With that, I'll go ahead and start with a share screen. And even though in the ULT we tend to write anonymously, but I wanted to introduce the vehicle of Ken Campos. And it's been sort of a spiritual discipline to try to identify, not with my physical body or my personality or my mind or any of that stuff, but sort of view that as if I was looking at a car on the street. This is the thing that I operate with, and that the me is actually the higher self me. So with that in mind, let me go ahead and do the share screen and share. So here we have Fohat Forces and Physics. And as this beautiful introductory slide was developed, we have a quote here from HPB Blavatsky: "The mind is the great slayer of the real. Let the disciple slay the real." So we here are students of Theosophy. We are the disciple. And this wonderful picture is actually a special photograph done with a quantum microscope, which is a new technology to me just a few years ago. And it's a picture of a hydrogen atom. The outer ring is the orbital of the one electron, and that inner group of, looks like red and yellow colors, is the one proton that's in the hydrogen atom. So hydrogen is very simple. It has only one proton, one electron, no neutrons, and no more than just one electron. So it's a really simple atom. And believe it or not, astronomers say that hydrogen is the most abundant element in the known observable universe. So my other nickname is Dr. Ken, and we're here at this United Lodge of Theosophy here in San Diego. And just who is this Dr. Ken vehicle? So as Jonathan had mentioned in the introduction, I was a student at Caltech, and this is a picture of the oral history project in 2022. And just to flash this on the screen here, in my fourth year of undergraduate school, I was actually a teaching assistant, so I'm kind of acting like a graduate student. And it was kind of funny, they put me on faculty and staff. I was not paid, it was a volunteer teaching assistant position, but I got good enough at biochemistry to be able to be a teacher of freshman students. And then after some years in my academic career, I spent some time at NIH in Bethesda, Maryland, doing 4 years of neurochemistry research. And among the Guru Parampada, as it says, to kind of recognize the teachers before me. So I had an oblique connection to this man who was the Danish physicist Niels Bohr, who came up with the Bohr model of the atom, which was then superseded by that wonderful picture we saw. So there you have the nucleus in the middle, and then you have electrons in little orbits like planets around the sun. And that math equation is about the energy of the electrons and the photons that they would emit. H is Planck's constant, V is the frequency. Now, this guy that I never met, Niels Bohr, was the mentor of this old fellow, Max Delbruck, who actually, he and I were friends in college. He was a biology professor who was a theoretical physicist and a protege of Niels Bohr. And Bohr put him on the challenge to look at the distinction between living and non-living matter. And he got a Nobel Prize for elucidating the basic structure of viruses with two other folks. And then at the end, he was working on something you might consider consciousness in mushrooms. And they were able to detect and be aware of O3, which is superoxide, a very highly reactive thing. And like bats emitting a sound and hearing the reflection of the sound, these mushroom mycelia would emit O3 and it would bounce off of something and they know they were close to an object and then react. Everyone at Caltech, as my undergraduate school, was connected to this man, Richard Feynman, this famous scientist. For 2 years, we studied his 3 volumes of lectures on physics. It was really hard, but we all of us did it. It's a small class, or 200 of us in each undergraduate class. And so that's a little bit about the vehicle that is the speaker here. And there's an Alan Watts quote saying that the sound of water is just as important as the words you're going to hear me say. And sound is very important in this discussion today. So before I came to the ULT, I was in Fresno in a study group, and we looked at different books. This one by David Bruce, some non-ULT, non-primary source material. It basically had the idea that theosophy is doctrines, but not dogmas. So there's no Spanish Inquisition that will force you to believe stuff. And this is some of the source material. And today's talk is from a little manual called Motion. And it's one chapter taken, one 18-page chapter, taken from The Secret Doctrine, pages 507 to 522 in volume 1. And theosophy, I just wanted to go over some words and terminology fairly quickly. Many of you in the audience already know this stuff, but again, it's useful to say. There is ether and there is ether. So part of the premise of this article called Correlation of Forces is Blavatsky is comparing esoteric science or theosophy or occultism, has different names, to modern Western European science, physics, and chemistry. So ether, the first word there is this metaphysical, omnipresent, pervading substrate or substratum, and it's erroneously identified as akasa. And actually, akasa is like the noumenon or the thing behind this spiritual ether, which is different than the physics ether. Prakriti and Purusha go together. Prakriti is the feminine, ever active, positive principle of nature, and Purusha is a masculine principle, pure consciousness or thought, and it's the self that pervades everything. Fohat, as the title of the talk is about, Fohat Forces and Physics, Fohat is this very mysterious thing. And I'll skip electricity for the moment. Fohat is this Tibetan word, and it's described in HPB's glossary as the active male potency of Shakti, the reproductive power of nature. So we have the masculine and feminine aspects. And it's also called essential cosmic electricity. And it has various manifestations depending on what plane you're looking at, which is a kind of a fascinating idea. Fohat is also called the one life. It's called the steed. And Fohat is, with the cosmic electricity, is akin to lightning. Some more terms that are used in this article, well, theosophy itself. It has different names. Perennial wisdom is one of them, occultism, esoteric science. Some might even say magic. But theosophy also comes from the Greek words of the wisdom, the Sophia of the gods, the theos. And interestingly enough, there's this whole article, there's the contradistinction between esoteric science and Western European science. So there is the idea of inertia in Western science, but in occultism, there's this other concept of inertia, same word. And she says that it's the greatest of all occult forces in this article. And then she talks several times during this 18-page article about planes of possible perception or planes of perception. And my understanding as a student myself of theosophy is that she's likely referring to levels or stages of conscious awareness. And one of the 3 basic stages of awareness we think of is waking, like right now I'm awake in this vehicle. There's dreaming, so part of the day I'm asleep, maybe a third of the day if I'm lucky. I'm asleep, or maybe a fourth of the day, whatever that is, 8 hours. And then I might dream and be aware of dreams. And that's another awareness of consciousness. And it's fascinating. And then there's deep dreamless sleep. And then the Theosophists and the Hindus talk about a 4th stage of consciousness called Turiya, in which this world appears dreamlike. But she goes on to say that there's many possible planes of perception. It's a fascinating concept. Fire is another theosophical word, and in the glossary, she talks about fire as the living fire, and says it's very occult. But she also says it's like a symbolic figure of speech, and that it's about the one life, and a symbol of the living sun, and that the sun's rays have different functions as well. Another phrase she uses in this article is supersensuous states. And by sensuous, she means things that we would perceive with our 5 physical senses. The hearing, smelling, seeing, touch, taste, those five senses. So super sensuous would be beyond those five physical senses. And so what I wrote here is that there are planes that are not perceived by our physical body's five senses, which is called it's hard to say, Sula Sarira. It's not really tongue twister, the STH, Sula Sarira. And notably, modern physics, this Western physical science that I was trained in, the Ken Campos vehicle was trained in that, is really only about the stuff that we can perceive with the five physical senses or with other measuring instruments that our modern technologies allow us to use. She also talks about the spiritual eye as perhaps a way to get past the sensuous senses and get into these super sensual perceptions. And in the Bhagavad Gita in chapter 11, there's a very dramatic description in that whole chapter of Lord Krishna, the avatar of Vishnu, endowing Arjuna temporarily with this spiritual eye. And he sees this dramatic reality of past, present, and future, and multiple possibilities and realities in this transcendental plane of perception. And he gets kind of freaked out by it and then kind of begs Krishna to take that spiritual eye away so he can see him in his regular form. And so that's a fascinating little hint that there are other ways of seeing the world, other kinds of perception. And then more of the Victorian words. She talks about HPV in this article, the terrene plane, the terrestrial aspect of things. And my interpretation is this is related to the physical body level, the level of plane of perception of basic classical Western science. And in the article, she really, in terms of the overview of the whole thing, she's comparing, as I mentioned, esoteric science, theosophy, with Western science, and she divides it into two parts. So in the 1880s, when the Secret Doctrine was published, 1888, 1889 timeframe, there were two opposing scientists at the time, chemists and physicists, the classical physics, which would be Galileo, Newton, Copernicus, those kind of physical guys, Faraday, Maxwell. And then the chemists would be really from the alchemical tradition, and then forming other chemical ideas. And I believe the periodic table of elements was being invented around that time or discovered around that time. More interesting little words are ego with a capital E. She refers to this as the immortal aspect of us as humans. That would be the higher triad of Atmi, Buddhi, Manas, and not our Freudian psychological ego, the little e ego, our persona, like this persona you're looking at here, that hear me talking here. And then, I think my bar is hiding part of it. One way of looking at the septenary nature, this seven-layered thing, is the Shula Sarira is this physical body, the vehicle. The Linga Sharira and Prana are the second and third, sometimes they're reversed. The vital energy, the life force, or Jiva, and it's Prana. Ruach, the Hebrews might call it, or Ka, the Egyptians, Chi, the Chinese would call it Prana. And the Linga Sharira is our astral self, which is really the part of us that is the template for our physical body in this esoteric way of understanding the world. And then as we move up the rank of these different principles, we have Kama, which is another aspect of us, and everything else in the world too, not just us as humans, but everything in the manifested world. Kama is about desire, it's a driving energy, an animal instinct, you might say. And next is Manas. And Manas is a fascinating thing. It's thought of as one thing, but also is divided at least into lower and higher, excuse me, but some people even divide it into 6 parts. So Manas, even though it's one thing, gets divided all up. And the lower Manas is our ordinary part, and there's part of it that could be called the Kama Manas, which is if we're running around in our human vehicle and our mental mind Manas part is more connected to desires and animalistic impulses and that sort of thing, will be more in the Kama Manas mind. And as we meditate and focus on higher ethics and moralities, we can then identify more with the higher Manas, the Buddhi Manas. And the part that's above the taskbar there is Atma, Buddhi, and the higher Manas. And those 3 are the reincarnating ego, the spiritual soul, you might say. Another way of looking at those that I typed up is the lower quaternary on the bottom of the slide. we have the Shula Sarira, or the Rupa, the physical body. And then it's interesting that sometimes Blavatsky writes that this physical body that I'm talking with you from is not even really a principle at all. It's actually very illusory, or some of the Sanskrit words are Maya, samsara. It's an illusory thing. It's really quite a strange mental gymnastics, because most of the time we identify as I am my body, I am my mind, I am my personality. But as I was introducing this Dr. Ken persona, that's not the real me. The real me is this upper triad. The prana is the next thing I was mentioning, the lingashura, the astral body, the template for the physical body, the kamarupa, and then the astral is actually a template for or a numinal blueprint for everything that is in the manifested world. So all of this Western physics and science is looking at the manifested world, but just right behind it is this astral aspect. And then again, the upper triad is the upper manas, the buddhi, and the atma. And so as in those introductory definitions of words, the planes of perception, I think, is somehow related to this 7. But then later into the end of the article, she even multiplies that by 7, and we get 49. So there are quite a variety of planes of perception. And then this is an interesting graphic from the motion pamphlet. It's kind of a fascinating look at, like, wow, what are we seeing? What's the real world anyway? And that's what this whole Western science is about. So another theosophical term, as we look at this, the whole article is really the argument or the exposition of the different ways of thinking about life and reality, using the esoteric science with its multiple ways and planes of perception, or the Western physical science in its 2 parts of chemistry and physics, Western science. So right off the bat, she says, you know, there's one of the materialistic physical guys is saying that atoms and matter is really dead matter. But he also adds that there is this independent force in the world. And she says, well, it's probably not just force only, but she calls it force substance, and I put there in quotes. And substance in the theosophical esoteric science is not materialistic matter that we think of as substance on the Shula Sarira plane, this myopic plane of Western science, but actually, you might say, a concept of material substance that would appear in various ways at the different planes of perception. So the easiest one for us to think of about today is in dreams. So in dreams, you might have a vivid dream or maybe a vague dream, and there's things happening in your dream. You might see other people, you might see rooms, doors, mountains, trees. And the idea is that those things really do have a substance, except it's in the dream world. And so the theosophical idea of substance is that it will appear at different levels of perception differently than it does to our waking level of perception, the one that Western science is on. Which is another way to think about this force substance thing, is that it's really related to akasa. And in the glossary, I'll just read this here. She describes in her 1882 glossary, she has a very lengthy description of akasa, and it's the noumenon of ether. So as I said earlier, it's erroneously identified as being equal to ether, but it's not exactly the same. But yet it's a thing that's right behind ether, sort of like the astral blueprint of the physical body and then the physical body. So those 2 things are very much connected. And this is the spiritual esoteric ether, which is this all-pervading, supersensual spiritual essence. And then later in the article, she mentions the Puranas. The Puranas are a group of Hindu literature, very allegorical stories and mythologies that contain some esoteric truths in them. And that in the Puranas and in various other parts of the secret doctrine, the important aspect of this all-pervading akasa is sound. Now, sound is a vibration. It's a fascinating thing. And so I she says akasa is related to logos, or the word, which is, again, sound. And then akasa is also a power. And then in my words here, I'm saying it's from that power or that sound, different things gnostically will emanate. And then one of the early emanations is occult electricity, which is Fohat, this mysterious Fohat thing we're talking about. And the akasa would also have different names on different planes. It could be the anima mundi on a higher plane, the spirit of the world, or the astral light on a lower plane, the Shulasura plane. And for us, it correlates with the higher Buddhimanas. Now, the premise of this article, as I mentioned before, is that it really has this distinction between esoteric science and then mostly Western science, but a little bit Western European Christian thought. And said both of those, Western science and Christian thought, are limited, and they don't see the whole truth, the same way that the occultists and the adepts from the East have seen over hundreds and thousands of years. And she writes in the beginning of The Secret Doctrine that this esoteric science is really a science in that the adepts have looked at things and compared with each other and validated things the way that a contemporary scientist at Caltech or NIH or MIT or, in London, at the Royal Academy or Cambridge, scientists will look at a thing, and then another scientist will look at the same thing, and if they see similar results, they compare them to each other and say, oh, this must be real. So this esoteric science was really developed that way. And that, as I mentioned, the first scientist in the article describes atom as dead matter, and she says, no, this isn't right. And the word atom is fascinating. It comes from the Greek language. The A in front of many Greek words is not, or the opposite of something. And the tom has various permutations in Greek language. It is about a cut or a piece of something that's left after you've divided it or cut it. So the atom is thought of something that is not able to be cut. So it was considered by early physicists as a solid, immovable, like rock-like thing. And of course, the chemists denied that. And then at the end here, she has this long footnote that logically, if something is dead, dead matter, the dead atom, that it implies that at one point it was alive. And then she says that the other thing that this scientist talks about is the a universal substance, and that also gets along with the idea of a ceaseless vibration. And adds that in occultism, the idea of a ceaseless vibration is present in things that we think are static, like a stone block, but really it's part of their reality. And this comes to light, the ceaseless vibration idea in quantum physics in this century. So back in the 1900s, so in the previous century. So 2 centuries ago in the 1800s, she mentions a Leyden jar, saying that is electricity a fluid and how can we store it? Light is also a fluid and we can store that too. And she goes in these distinctions between modes of motion and fluids, and saying, well, are they really different? Are they really the same? And just to say, what is a Leyden jar? It's a primitive capacitor, and a capacitor is a device that can store electric charge. And they're used in computers nowadays, along with now they're just kind of embedded in silicon in computers, so they're not a big giant jar like in this picture. But the Leyden jar is basically a capacitor. And computers use them, like this computer we're talking on your computer at home. They use capacitors, they use resistors and inductors to form logical gates for the computer software to come up with meanings with the ones and zeros. So that's a Leyden jar, an electric capacitor. And it's interesting, we do use the word liquid and fluid-like words to describe electricity today. We might say there's an electric current. Well, but what do you mean by current? Well, that's a flow of something, like a current of water in a river. So the idea of fluid is still in our modern Western science. Earlier, before Maxwell, there's this other fellow, Michael Faraday, and he made some interesting observations in the lab about electricity and magnetism, and described a relationship between a magnetic field that's moving and electric current. Now, in things like Hoover Dam, we use these principles every day. And the idea here is that In Hoover Dam, the water flows past the mechanical turbine, which spins around, and in that spinning connected to the turbine are coils of, of, of wire, and there's large magnets, solid magnets around the turbine, and the wires moving through the magnetic field will generate electric current, and that's what we use, in Phoenix, Arizona, and Los Angeles, and San Diego. There's electricity from Hoover Dam, and generated by Michael Faraday's discoveries of that connection between those two separate forces. Later in the 1800s, they were unified as one force called electromagnetism. And then in this, I believe it was now in the 2000s, electricity and magnetism have been linked with what was considered the fourth force, or the weak internuclear force, which was responsible for a thing called beta decay. So really, it's called the electroweak force by some of the modern quantum mechanics people. And the weak force, as I mentioned, beta decay, it's when a neutron in the atom converts itself to a positively charged proton and an anti-neutrino. Kind of weird, but it's part of the physics that is involved in, say, atomic bombs. They use the weak nuclear force. And going back to Michael Faraday in the early 1830s, here's just a little picture of the magnet. So I was talking about Hoover Dam. So if you have a magnet, a solid magnet moving through coiled wires, you'll generate an electric current. And this thing called an ammeter, the AAM meter, it just measures electric current. And then he has some of the little math about that, which won't get into the details of the math, just to say that there is math that Faraday and others have described. And the d theta over dt is from Isaac Newton's calculus. So Newton and in Germany, Leibniz invented this mathematical formalism called calculus, where you look at the rates of change of a function. So that's what these derivatives are, the d's.
Ken, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I want to see if I can get rid of that bar.
Okay.
I think it's interfering with some things.
Just move it to the bottom, maybe?
I don't know how to move it.
It won't move.
No, I didn't try.
Well, let's just do the unthinkable here.
Go into more on the right. Yeah, all the way on the end, the
Go to
top.
more.
Yeah, see what's there. Maybe it can help you move it. Don't see anything.
You can move it with the mouse.
Hide.
Just drag it. It won't drag down.
Oh, yeah, there it goes.
Maybe to the bottom.
Just put it on the bottom.
Oh, yeah.
Way down there. Yeah, there you go.
Excellent.
Then go back to it.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I couldn't figure out how to do that myself. So next in this 18-page article, Blavatsky talks about force and what its force is, and the title again is Correlation of Forces. She mentions that science really doesn't understand forces at all, and really the correlation has to do with the things we were talking about earlier, the akasa, the ether, Fohat, as this energetic force that comes through these different layers of reality, these different planes of perception, these different principles that then shows up in our world as force. And she says this mysterious it that is force. And she also complains about the scientists in the 1800s who, in their argument with the Roman Catholic European dogma of papal infallibility, they're trying to make themselves as infallible scientists and thought they had understood the whole universe and the whole world. However, there were some physical mysteries still in the 1800s that got solved later. One of them is that Maxwell's equations, which I'll show you in a minute, they don't work if you're moving at different speeds compared to other observers. And there was a solution to that after Maxwell and before Einstein. So there was a chink in the armor. And the early guy, Faraday, with his electromagnetism, was quoted in a symposium as saying he has utter ignorance of the nature of matter. And I say it's now pretty mysterious today with our understanding of quantum physics. So again, this force thing, as I was mentioning, it's really this emanation, this kind of Gnostic evolution from the most abstract akasa to the ether to Fohat, and then it shows up in different forms. Like here we have the mechanical, the thermal, the chemical, the electrical, the magnetic, which Western science says are the causes, but actually Blavatsky is saying esotericism, they're an effect of something. They're not a cause. That behind these forces, there is this noumenal or this pre-Gnostic reality. And then what is force? So in Western science, we'll go with that. Newton has this equation, and he was preceded by Galileo. They had a funny idea that these things would act instantaneously. In a sense, the speed of light was instantaneous. It's not. Or that the speed of causality is instantaneous. So Newton and Galileo had that mistaken concept. And here we have that little equation in the middle of the slide here, F equals ma, where m is mass, that mysterious thing, what is mass, what is matter, and then acceleration, which is defined below here. So we have in physics, Western European physics, we have speed, which is distance over time, how fast an object seems to be moving. The vector is, you get the speed of it plus a direction in XYZ space, and that's called a vector in physics and in math. And acceleration is any change in the speed or the direction. So you might say, for example, the vector of the Earth going around the sun is constantly changing. Now the speed is about the same as the Earth goes around the sun, but its vector is changing every day because it's going in a different direction, because it's going in a circle. So that's kind of weird. So the Earth is accelerating, even though it's going at the same speed. So it's kind of a weird kind of physics nomenclature, just like the esoteric nomenclature. And again, at the bottom, we mentioned this error of infinite speed of effects. As I was mentioning, that this esotericism really is scientific. And you can look at this a little more details. You know, this will be recorded and put on YouTube. You could read this more easily. Again, referencing the 7 principles and then this idea of esoteric substance. And it's curious, Blavatsky is very humorous. She mentions that Western science has one idea of substance or matter, whereas esotericism has these multiple ideas of what substance is and how it can manifest, like in our physical world, in our dream world. Those are two that you and I can understand, but there's actually other planes of perception as well. One of them I'll touch on is through shamanism, and that you can see non-ordinary reality in a shamanic journey. So HPB jokingly compares modern science and the understanding of one substance to the Frenchman making a quip about the European, the British. So in France, they have a very advanced culinary culture. Their food and their sauces and everything is amazing. And you go to a French restaurant, it's really expensive. So in England, the Frenchman is quipping, England has 36 different religions, but has only one fish sauce. So we just got to say, the same thing Blavatsky is saying. Esotericism has all these different planes of perceptions and different forms of substance, but Western physical science has only one matter, only one substance. Just like the British have only one fish sauce. And then the types of forces in this article called Correlation of Forces, she spends a lot of time in this article in the argument between chemistry and one scientist, she mentions him a lot, named Butleroff, Professor Butleroff, and the idea of the elastic movable atom that can interface and interchange with other atoms versus the modern physicists in the 1880s who are materialistic with a capital M. And she says that idea has to go. And indeed, it did leave Western science. So we do no longer believe in a solid physical atom of the materialists of the 1800s. That's inelastic. And Butleroff gives an interesting premonition of Heisenberg and Schrodinger and all these quantum mechanics people by logically figuring out that if an atom is elastic, then it must be made of parts. And he even has the phrase subatoms. So it's an interesting premonition that Blavatsky notes that Butleroff has commented on. But then logically, and again, logic and reason is one way to think about the world. If you look at the divisible atom that can be broken up into parts, what about the idea that you can break the parts into more parts and have it be infinitely divisible? And then Butleroff goes on to say, well, maybe atoms are not any physical thing at all, but really just a center of force. So we're back to that idea of force. And so, again, just to remind you, from the Akasa to the ether to the Fohat, and then Fohat and Prakriti linking together, and then coming down this cascade of planes of perception will come to the force being manifested as what we call an atom. It's very fascinating. And the inertia is the F equals ma, as I put here, the force equals matter times acceleration. So the matter or the mass will have inertia in that it resists the force. So as heavy as the thing is, it resists being moved or affected by a force, whatever the force is. And this is a fascinating idea. And she says that Western science has a little hint about inertia, and yet inertia is a very important and significant idea and concept in esoteric science. And she says that force actually is an intelligent active power. So these different things, the akasa, the ether, the fohat, have a kind of intelligence to them. Although it's really an error to anthropomorphize them or make them seem like they're people. They're entities, but they're not people entities. And sometimes, as I mentioned, the masculine and feminine, folks might write about or talk about Fohat as a he, but it's really not a masculine he. It's an intelligent active power or principle. And what our Western science calls Mayavik or Maya, that Sanskrit word, the illusory nature of matter and material, is the Shula Sarira, that seventh principle, which might not be a principle at all, where we live. And Shula is a word for differentiated manifestation. So it's a fascinating kind of Sanskrit word. So there is a doctrine in occultism, which he points out in the article, that there is the elusive nature of what we're seeing as matter on our plane, and that the infinite divisibility of atoms or matter, and that things are really a manifestation of force. And HPB says that these two concepts open up the idea of esoteric substance on limitless planes, not just the 7 planes or the 49 planes, but just limitless planes, which gets a little overwhelming. It's like, what? I thought 7 is too many, but that's the way it is. And he says that scientists often confuse forces and causes and effects. And at the end of the article, on pages 55, 6, and 7, she talks about the Puranas in some great detail. I won't mention a lot of it here, but just to say that in the Puranas, there are myths and stories and allegories, sort of like Aesop's fables, or maybe in the New Testament, Jesus' parables. They're stories, and they talk about the multifaceted aspect of the nature and fire. So some of these children are called fires, and one of them is a fire of manifestation. And in the Vishnu Purana, there's a personified fire which shows up as ether, the physical ether, light, air, water, earth, and other propensities. Sound is the other fascinating thing about this, because akasa is associated with sound. And then says, by the combination of these fires, or these Gnostically emanated entities or principles, by the combination of these things, then we can have living entities like plants and animals and us as people. And Mula Prakriti, she mentions that as the world stuff, this substance that manifests into the forms that we see. Then she ends up talking about Vedanta and Advaita, understanding that the differentiated condition of matter is part of what we're experiencing, and that really Parabrahma might be the only real thing that exists out there. And then coming back to the idea of vibration. So vibration in occultism really foreshadows Einstein and the subatomic physics and the quantum theorists. Let me take a quick little view of that. And shamanism is another way to have planes of perception. I have NOR, or non-ordinary reality. I had the great pleasure of meeting not Mircea Eliade, but Michael Harner, and read his book in 1900. And this century, went to some of his classes and experienced some shamanic journeying. So it's another way, without any drugs or substances, to experience other perceptions. And Aldous Huxley wrote a book using mescaline called The Doors of Perception. So the idea that there really are other ways of seeing things. And just to show you, just to flash in front of your eyes, Maxwell's equations from the late 1800s about electricity and electromagnetism that's now gotten to include the weak force, the electroweak force. And this del is actually, the little upside down delta is a calculus function for differential equations. Here's a little, just a flash in front of your eyes, the idea. I won't go into it. What this del is, that upside down delta, is again a calculus thing. And it's about the instantaneous rate of change of a particle, like a photon. And then speaking of photons and Maxwell's electromagnetism, photons are the massless particle that has a vibration. And these upside down, these undulating curves here are frequencies. And then these other numbers of hertz describe different measurement of frequencies. And then on the bottom of the picture, there's different devices. So on the far right, you have a nuclear power plant, generating gamma waves, very high frequency photons. And there's X-rays that we use in the chest X-ray. They're not quite as energetic. And then we have things like cell phones and Wi-Fi and things like that. That little rainbow in the middle is what our eyeballs can perceive in the physical eye. And interestingly enough, the idea is that on the astral plane is where the real vision happens, and then it's kind of manifested and seems to be occurring to our physical eyes. But really, we can have awareness of these different things. And curiously enough, the infrared is also associated with heat, just past the red. And other animals like snakes, for instance, have organs in which they can perceive the infrared. Excuse me. Another thing as the centuries in physics progresses is Albert Einstein and the idea of special relativity in 1905 and general relativity in 1915. So back in my high school days, the vehicle of Ken Campbell wrote an article on black holes in general and special relativity. And that graph there is a little graph of space and time that Minkowski came up with. First, there was Maxwell's equations, which didn't work at different observer speeds. And then the Lorentz transformations fixed that. And then Einstein wrote special relativity, equating matter and energy, and inventing this thing called space-time, which is shockingly like a casa in that it pervades all of the known universe. And then there's this idea of different directions in space and time you can go in. And then the 1905 was when he wrote a couple of articles which formed general relativity. And there was another guy in between 1905 and 1915, Minkowski, who came up with some ideas about space and time. And then Einstein used that to come up with special relativity and predicted waves of gravity, and then really overturned the idea from Galileo and Newton that these forces act instantaneously, and came up with this letter c, which is the speed of light, which is also the speed of causality in our world. And now gravitation is what Einstein's theories are about. They're about gravity and space-time as being a curvature of four-dimensional space-time. Unfortunately, Western science is not totally caught up with theosophy and the occult sciences. And Judge, in one of the articles in this book called Ocean of Theosophy, and in the article, Blavatsky touches on it, that gravitation, for instance, is sympathy and antipathy, or repulsion and attraction. And Judge goes on to explain it has to do with the polarity of things. And in the Guru Parampara at the beginning, I was mentioning that the vehicle of this Ken person here talking to you was connected to Kip Thorne a little bit. And in 2017, a few years ago, he and two others got a Nobel Prize for detecting waves of gravity that Einstein had predicted more than 100 years earlier. So again, this wave, this frequency, this vibration aspect of science is coming more and more into modern Western physical science, just the way it is in the occult sciences. Actually got to meet Kip Thorne, and I have here just a little flash of a letter he sent to me back in 1976 when I sent him my article on special relativity. There's a thing called LIGO, L-I-G-O. It's two interferometer, big, gigantic, kilometer-long detectors that Kip Thorne and the other scientists use to detect gravity waves. After Einstein and the 1915 stuff, then the idea from Schrodinger came along that the photons and the energy of electrons doesn't occur continuously, sort of like overturning Galileo and Newton. But it actually happens in levels or quanta, and hence the idea of quantum mechanics. And so we have this energy is frequency and vibration, and that the other weird ideas from this mathematical science is that particles are really waves, but then they have a dualistic aspect as a particle. So they're a wave and a particle, both, depending on how you look at them. And the idea in quantum physics, it really does fulfill Butler-Ross ideas, the chemists from the 1800s, that excuse me, subatomic particles are centers of force. And they're these centers of this wave-like energy that we saw in that electromagnetic spectrum picture. And just to flash in front of your eyes, we got Schrodinger equation, the wave equations, and he's got all these funny mathematical symbols. The H, the big H, the little h, the calculus D's, and then the psi, which is about the position of a particle in space and time. This is another lecture. I'll just flash this up here and go past it. The H with the H is Planck's constant, which is a physical thing. If you put a slash on it, you divide it by 2 times pi to convert from Cartesian XYZ coordinates to radians, which is another way of describing things in space and time. And psi is that function tells about the position of a particle. And there's this weird thing, the Schrodinger's cat concept, that there's a thought experiment that
Is it dead or
in
not?
quantum mechanics, a particle could be in 2 different states, like a photon could be in one spin state or another spin state, or a proton or a neutron could be in one spin state or another spin state. Actually, I take that back, photons don't have spin, but the neutrons and the protons do, and subatomic particles like quarks do. And that with quantum mechanics, you can't know what state they're in until you look at them. So here we have this cartoon, and he's saying, Schrodinger's saying, I don't know if the cat is dead or alive until I watch inside the box. Because the idea is that you imagine there's a cat in a box with something that could kill the cat, it might kill the cat. So either the cat's alive or it's dead, but you don't know until you look. And then the cat meows, and he's saying, shut up, I'm supposed to look first. So it's kind of silly. And then, again, the physical ether started in the 1830s with one fellow, McCullough. And then it got, in Michelson and Morty's experiments at Annapolis Naval Academy, they proved that ether doesn't exist. But a couple of years ago, in 2022, there's this modern scientist that I encountered on YouTube, Unsicker, who was very skeptical about a lot of the science. The way Blavatsky is saying in the late 1880s, that science has a lot of dilemmas and problems that they're just sweeping under the rug. So Unsicker is saying that now in this century, the 2020s, Western science still has a bunch of things we're pushing under the rug, and maybe we need to bring ether back. And in 1960, there was an idea very much like a casa called the Higgs field, and it's thought to pervade all of space, and it gives a virtual particle to a subatomic particle, or it takes it away. The field isn't affected, but this particle goes back and forth. And so in a sense, it can change its state or its polarity, like William Von Judge talking about gravity in the ocean of theosophy. And in that changing of polarity, these particles like a proton or a neutron can actually get mass or inertia. So we're back to that inertia idea from occultism. There's a lot of fascinating stuff here. And then there's an editorial from 2018 saying that, well, quantum theory really is telling us that nature is giving us some giant hints that mind or consciousness or awareness is an intrinsic part of the world. And then this fascinating sentiment that all matter, not just matter living in our human physical brains, but all matter is the outer appearance of an inner experience at the quantum level. Different configurations of matter reflecting different patterns or modes of mental activity. So this is fascinating. This is sort of ascribing mental activity to a casa, or to the Higgs field, or to space-time. And then going along with that, there's this one old fellow, Roger Penrose, who was a quantum mechanics guy, now very old, and he's come up with this idea that quantum mechanical processes can affect our cells, our nerve cells, and affect a thing called microtubules. So again, as above, so below, cells, believe it or not, have a skeleton just like we do, and it's made of microtubules. And this other fellow here in the anesthesiology mask, he's the one that teamed up with Roger Penrose and said, hey, yeah, these microtubules do exist, and quantum activity could affect them because they're very small inside of the cell. And that Roger Penrose is then postulating that groups of neurons in our brain, so maybe like neural pathways, big giant macroscopic sets of nerves, can be affected by the quantum level of activity. And this could be a way that the pranic and astral planes of reality that esotericism talks about could interact with nerves in our cardiac plexus, in the heart, and that these can exert, quote, force on the nervous cell tissues through these microtubules and this quantum thing in the substructure of reality, and that force can then influence the heart, and then through the vagus nerve, influence our brain and our thoughts and our mind. So the idea of quantum consciousness as not coming from the brain itself, but really coming from these astral forces that we were hearing about the other day is, I think, something that we can begin to piece together with both the esotericism of the 1800s, secret doctrine, and some really cutting edge aspects of modern Western physics that are still mysterious. But indeed, I do see a pathway where the Gnostic Akashic energy can filter down into something pranic and astral, affect our heart, and then affect our mind. With that, let me open up for any questions or comments. All right, so we have a question from the audience here in San Diego at the Lodge from Desiree.
So you talked a little bit, thank you, first of all, because that was quite a presentation, a lot of information. So thanks for that. Helps a lot. And I was curious about what you talked about, antipathy, sympathy. How does affinity fit into that? Can affinity have a relationship? Do we even know what affinity is?
Mhm.
And also, why has it, maybe you have some insight, where did the electric field go or ether go in all of this? Seems like it just sort of fell off the map. It was a constant with Faraday, it was a constant with Maxwell, Maxwell being a student of Faraday, actually. But why was there a controversy about having ether?
Mhm. It has to do with idea of physics of action at a distance and action in which there's nothing to propagate the action. So the ether was in the physical science. There's like water in the ocean, and then a wave in the ocean is going through the water in the ocean, but yet there's energy in the wave. And so the idea that photon energy of the electromagnetic force needed something to travel through, it needed a medium to travel through. And so that was where the idea of ether came from and how it might be coming back, that there's some medium in space-time. There were two scientists that tried to do something like Kip Thorne did with, and the other scientists, the whole group of scientists, a lot of people, Kip just one of them, that created this LIGO thing to detect gravity waves. So I believe that what happened in the late 1800s at Annapolis, Maryland, with Michelson and Morley, they did an experiment to detect ether using light, but their scale was so small compared to the LIGO thing, which is miles long. It's a laser with mirrors and things, interferometer that's kilometers big. It's a gigantic thing. So I think the experiment that Michelson and Morley did to disprove ether was using technology that wasn't adequate to prove it or disprove it either way. And so they came up with the wrong answer from their experiment. And then they killed the idea of ether. And then we just landed up on this concept of force fields, just emanating through nothing in particular, being mediated by photons,
Yeah.
which are these massless particles, a particle with no mass, but that's kind of weird.
Yeah.
It's traveling at the fastest speed that anything in causality could happen, which is the speed of light, according to Einstein, that little c constant.
Yeah, I see.
And so then ether got discarded, but I think it's coming back.
Well, and the C constant is another kind of an issue with me, myself, because when you talk about affinity and things happening instantaneously, so far apart from each other, there's no way that C constant is constant there. So, and I'm wondering if affinity, going back to my initial question, has a role in this. Because if there is an affinity between, let's just say, two poles, their communication is going to be instantaneously if there's that affinity there. So even though you have antipathy and sympathy, there is that central force that pretty much eliminates our idea of time.
Yes, and there's one thing I was looking at this week. I glanced at it and said, no, that's a little bit off topic there. But there's several scientists and philosophers and other folks that were talking about time.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
the whole question is, was Einstein's concept of time erroneous? Is it wrong? Now, I didn't talk about other aspects of subatomic physics. So the idea that protons and neutrons themselves are made of smaller things. And so this Feynman guy from my arduous 2 years of studying his lecture books, all of us at Caltech did, has this idea of quarks. And quarks have 3 different charge states, not positive and minus like a proton and an electron, but they have 3 states and they call them colors, red, green, and blue. And so we came up with this thing called quantum chromodynamics for the colors of these things. And so there's the idea that an instantaneous affinity occurs at the quark world, and the quark force they're held together by something called gluons. Again, these physicists are making up fancy words for these particles that they're observing in high energy physics, things like at CERN or the Batavia laboratory or other places like that, where they do high energy physics, subatomic physics experiments. So the idea of a gluon is like a proton for electromagnetic force, and it deals with this strong internuclear force, but it is different in that it creates a tube or a tunnel between the 2 particles that it connects. And that could be the quote affinity of an instantaneous communication. And there's a modern concept which I don't really understand at all called quantum entanglement. And that's something that can occur instantaneously. The 2 distant particles can have an instantaneous connection to each other. And it's going to be through the gluon, which theoretically, again, it's like making up stories. Like say, the sky is blue because it's colored blue. It's like these 2 particles are connected to each other because of these gluons, which are connected through a tube in physics. So physics is coming up with these stories to really be able to identify and to explain affinity, which would be that instantaneous connection of things. And that is different than William Quan Judge's idea about gravity and sympathy and antipathy. Donovan, you got something?
Yeah. I've never really understood these 4 forces. And sometimes they say there's 3 and this and that.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, okay, so the 4 forces that I learned about 20 years ago was gravity, electromagnetism, strong intranuclear, and weak intranuclear.
Yes.
And you've told me recently that they've really figured out that the strong and weak intranuclear are really kind of one. But now you just now said something that the weak is part of the electromagnetism. But why would there be a difference in forces inside intranuclear, inside an atom, than outside even anyway? And then is there anything in HPV's discussion that kind of pertains to my question?
I would say all of the forces work by waves and vibrations. We're getting back to that Akasha and the sound thing. So that would be how what we're seeing in this correlation of forces is that the Western physical sciences are talking about these forces and particles that go on waves and vibrations, and that connects it to the Akasha and the sound, which is a wave. The idea of the internuclear force was a couple of weeks ago. I was misremembering that it was the 2 internuclear forces that were together. That was wrong.
Okay.
It's actually electromagnetism and the weak force.
Okay.
So the weak force is for a process called beta decay, which is when a neutron, which is about the same size in the nucleus of an atom as a proton. So the proton has a positive charge, the neutron has no charge at all. And then spontaneously, under the influence of this quote weak force, the neutron divides itself into a proton and an antineutrino and sends those out as energy. And so it's energy and more mass. And it's that beta decay function that's mediated by something called a virtual boson in these theories. It gets very detailed. It's like, oh wait, this is a whole nother lecture. And the idea is that these bosons have a mass, but if you the standard model quantum mechanics people have done some of these experiments in the high energy physics of being able to take a boson particle and accelerate it or give it enough energy so that it's similar to a photon of the electromagnetic force. And then they're saying at one part of the spectrum, it's really kind of identical to that. So then that links it to Maxwell's electromagnetism. And so the weak and electromagnetic force are joined together as the electroweak force. However, in physics books and YouTube, the four forces are still listed as four separate forces. So modern media hasn't totally caught up with the theoretical physicists that are working on the standard model of quantum mechanics. And it's funny, I was talking to a young Berkeley graduate in physics, and he was calling the stuff I learned from Feynman as classical quantum thermodynamics. It's like classical, I feel old. But no, it's from the 1960s, so it's 60, 70 years ago.
Well, once you flip the camera.
And do we have any other questions from the audience on Zoom land?
You have something in chat.
Oh, chat, let me look at it. Thank you.
LAS did something.
Did Einstein read The Secret Doctrine?
Actually, you know, his daughter, the daughter of Albert Einstein, it might have been a niece, a female younger relative, actually found a copy of The Secret Doctrine on his desk as he was dying and after he died, posthumously, as evidence that, in fact, he was reading The Secret Doctrine. And it is very curious to me that in 1905, with the idea of space-time in special relativity, he's giving the idea that there's a substrate to the universe, which is very much like Akasa and ether in the esoteric version of ether, and that there's a substrate to the world that we're living in, and that it's manifesting through different planes of reality. So I think at one level he was very curious about, I think, the secret doctrine and the doctrines presented there, because she does say that, listen, these other scientists of the inner world, through their meditational practices, these adepts from centuries and thousands of years ago, have looked within and they've looked at the nature of the world. They've had other experiences and they've compared them to each other the way physical scientists do. And they've come up with a set of occult science principles and ideas which are validated with each other. So in Secret Doctrine, she's claiming that this scientific process has occurred, except in a part of reality that is, you might say, more imaginary or mental or metaphysical, but it is something that humans have done. And so Einstein, I think, as a scientist, is really interested in that. So I would say to LAS, the answer is yes. And the question is, did he read it before he came up with theory of relativity? That I don't know, but he did read it. And look at it, was aware of it.
I have a question.
Yes.
You were talking earlier about these different planes,
Yes.
and I thought you said in one of your slides that there was a correlation between them.
Mhm.
Was that true, or how is it? What's the correlation?
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked that. So one thing that I've been struggling with over these last many years, and some of the other theosophists on Friday and Saturday have helped me understand this, and even here in our San Diego group, is that the Western science that I have drunk deeply from that cup of Western science, this vehicle of Ken, Dr. Ken here, really have to realize that these different 7 planes, the septenary nature of man and of reality, is actually all happening at once, and it's all right here, right now. So it's not like they're in a different place, but they're right here. These different planes of perception. So the astral body is in correlation in space and time with the physical body. And the astral, I was saying, is like the blueprint of the physical for everything, but including, it's easy to just talk about the personal human body, but it's everything, a rock, a book, everything we see, a mountain, a tree, a cat, a dog. They all have this astral blueprint that's on another plane of perception, you might say. And then beyond that, there's the jiva or the prana, the life force energy plane. And I would say, and then the kama, the desire plane. And that all these are different than the physical, but they all are in the same place, you might say. They're all with us kind of simultaneously. And so then as we change our awareness, either through meditation, dhyana, or through a shamanic journey, we can then, or the adepts doing their meditational practices as they purify themselves and go through all their renunciations to be able to see these different planes, or able to perceive these different levels of reality. The dream is, I would say, the first easy one that we can compare to. Substance here, like we're seeing the lectern and the computer and everything, is one substance or matter that we're perceiving. But in a dream, we also see things in dreams. And the question is, what are those things? And esotericism says that it's substance, but on a different plane of reality.
Right. Well, when I think of correlation, I think of from finance background, so I think of how they're changing relative to each other. Do they change relative to each other?
Actually, it's thought in this kind of Gnostic emanation concept that is from the top down, in a sense. So we first have these. Again, my science knowledge and vocabulary is way better than my theosophy. It's like being bilingual. It's way better than my Hindu, Sanskrit, Tibetan theosophical vocabulary. But there's this, in the proem of the secret doctrine, there's this idea of this ineffable, indescribable principle from which everything arises or emanates. And that principle, you might say, is God, but it's not an entity. And Blavatsky says that it's something that's beyond our human brain capacity to understand. So I would say the correlation is top down. So from this primary principle in the proem, then comes other levels of manifestation. And the Hindus and the Theosophists and the Buddhists have come up with a lot of different words to describe this. Brahma, and then we get in the Trimurti of the Hindu gods, and then different manifestations, the Purusha, the Prakriti, the Logo, the Dhyan Chohan. So it's emanating downward. And one way I like to think of this emanation is in an automobile, you have the engine of a car and an internal combustion engine, and that pistons are rotating, the drive shaft at a certain 2,000, 3,000 RPM, so revolutions per minute, going pretty fast. And then it's geared down through the transmission to the tires on the ground, which aren't going anywhere near 2,000 revolutions a minute, like the engine is. So this ineffable principle going to the different Parabrahm and the Prakriti and the Logo, whatever order, I'm kind of messing it up here. Like I said, my theosophic vocabulary isn't quite as strong, but it goes down through these levels of emanation. And one concept in theosophy is, in terms of the correlations idea, the one thing affecting another, is that the one above, you might say, or the more energetic one, then has like a numinal effect on the next one, which you might say is the upadhi, or the outward manifestation of it, sort of like you might say a fire and smoke. So the smoke is around the fire, but it's not the fire. So the fire is generating the smoke. So in a sense, these higher things correlate and influence and cause the perception of the fire causes the smoke, for instance. And so as these layers of energy and fohat and reality and substance manifest down to our level, we're influenced by that, but we're not totally that, but we're connected to that.
And I think it too, in terms of the correspondences, that the correspondences are there, they're archetypal, so it's a pattern over a pattern over a pattern. It's expressing itself just like fractals do. So you have the same pattern that's being expressed throughout, but it's basically a smaller replica of what its parent was. So in that sense, they are corresponding, they are or correlating.
And when I was thinking, when you put them together, it was like one moving in opposite direction by the other.
There's a saying that
Correlation.
the spirit kind of gives up a part of itself to become matter, matter gives up a part of itself to become spirit. So you have like this flow of energy, and even each way says that you've got that matter in the densest sense is just dense with the denseness of spirit is equal to, or another expression of spirit, which is etherealized matter. So you're still dealing with matter. It's just one is dense and one is spirit, and one kind of giving up itself to help the other. In a sense, it's reciprocated.
Symbiotic.
Yes.
And in terms of these theosophical doctrines, which are not dogmas, there's this whole idea of reincarnation. So we go through this cycle of life from birth, middle age, old age, death, and then the Atma Buddhi Manas, the immortal part of our sevenfold nature, goes through this other part of reality, and it's called the Devachanic plane. In Christianity, you might call it what is the word? Heaven and purgatory. So there's this idea that our soul, our spirit is going through this other process. So in terms of a correlation and the lower affecting the higher, indeed, the experience of the incarnated life, say if we're a person that's more connected to kama manas, that we're more desire driven, more want, the fancy house or the big car or some other desire driven, attachments to physical reality, more comic in that desire nature, then that will affect the fate of the Atma Buddhi Manas. So indeed, it's not just all the way down, but it's also going upwards too. So I think that answers your, I didn't think of it until you asked the question, is there a correlation where the effect will go the other way, from the lower to the higher? And I would say the answer is yes, because as this whole theosophical school and esoteric teaching is that we want to do a lot of renunciation, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of letting go of our comic nature, of our animalistic nature, and become more human-like, as opposed to more animal-like. And that we then can be attached more to the higher manas, and then that higher manas, Atma Buddhi Manas, immortal part of us, then can go through the Devachanic experience and then have a life like Mahatma Gandhi in India. Then we can reincarnate and do something like that because we've purified ourselves in earlier incarnations. So yes, so definitely there is a back and forth correlation.
Thank you.
And I think, okay, we have
Hi.
another question. We have
Yes. Yes.
You get to
Good
her.
morning. Well
Hello.
done. I was very impressed about the amazing research that you did. I'm still trying to digest it because it was, amazing. And thank you for that. My question, well, I have a previous question. I'm going to just have another point of information regarding Einstein. I was in conversation with somebody from the TS, and they actually have receipts that NASA as well bought books from the Secret Doctrine way back. And also, there is some document that prove that back way in when after Einstein died, there was somebody, they were not sure if it was related or the secretary, that actually brought an Einstein Secret Doctrine with a bunch of notes, and it was given to them, and later on disappeared. They don't know who stole it. And then, but they did have record that happened, and witnesses as well. Then also there were some scientists, theosophists that actually visit him, his home, and they saw that he had the secret doctrine on his desk. Yes, as we know, also Edison was a member of the Theosophical Society. Yes, the greatest mind, the greatest intellectual of the time came in touch with the Theosophical Society and HPB teachings. Nobody can, dispute that. And for the fact that, yes, a lot of this discovering help science because they use material that was available that opened up doors, is still opening doors, because as you know, NASA, look at what NASA's doing. And they went to space and all that, and they just confirm a lot of things that were written in the Secret Doctrine. They can confirm it. So yes, there is a lot of the HPB and the master's material have helped science but it was part of the plan. And I guess at this point, not much is going to be revealed anymore because we never got the secret. HPV apparently wrote the third volume with the secret doctrine, and nobody knows what happened to it. It was also discussion about the fourth volume, but she said only if we earn it, it will be revealed.
Yes.
Because she said, as it was, the secret doctrine, we were not ready for it either. So a lot of things was premature. As you know, that Hitler and other, people use the material of the secret doctrine for the darkness. They use it for the wrong purposes and use even the symbol. And it's corrupt. They already, they corrupt the symbols and the meaning of it. So I can understand why, maybe they stop us from getting anymore because we, like children playing with matches, we're going to we can get very destructive. Now, I have a question regarding ether and akasha.
Yes, yes. And
As we know, and you pointed out nicely that akasha ether has to do with sound. Now, my question is, as this flower we call humanity keeps developing and blossoming, if we call it that, there are going to be some people, and actually there are some people in this world that they're more advanced than the other, and some of them already have some even clairvoyance and all these powers. Whether it was prematurely or not, I have no idea. But we know that. I want to give you an example. Barbara Streisand is considered had the greatest voice belt in the world, and she confessed that she hears sounds all the time, and she's able to give it the highest note as far as a belt than any other person so far. So I imagine that maybe she's tapping into that ether, like Akasha, perhaps. I was wondering if and I think because when you develop, as we develop toward the sixth sense, clairvoyant, but it's also the Akasha is the one that is showing up right now. It's not totally revealed to us. And as we are into the 4 3/4 round, right? And HPV said that a lot of things is going to get scored away, including these 5-week races, by the time we reach the 5th round. And since we are in the 5th race, and as we move forward into the 5th race up, I'm wondering if this is part of maybe the signs of that. Do you have any comments?
Yes, Maluka. Thank you for those comments about the Akasha and whatnot. And going back to Barbara Streisand, your comments about her and her voice and the idea that she's hearing sounds really touches me with the idea of auditory hallucinations. So the other part of this vehicle called Ken here is psychiatry, and I focused my middle years of my life, 20 years or 25 years, on psychosis and the idea of hallucinations. However, with these ideas of planes of perception, I have to say that what modern psychiatry is calling a pathological hallucination may actually be an overlap with, or maybe be 100%, the concept that the innocent patient person who's suffering with awareness of other sounds or voices talking to them is actually not having a false hallucination, but actually is able to tap into another plane of awareness. And there were studies of Anglicans, religious people in Britain who pray and they talk to God or they talk to Jesus, and they will hear a voice talking back to them. And yet they're regular folks, they pay their taxes, they go to jobs, they have a house and a mortgage and a cat and a dog, but yet they hear voices. And so it's not pathological. It's a normative thing for maybe 10 or 15% of these Anglicans that were surveyed. And there is also a thing called the Hearing Voices Network. Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, was also thought to hear music in his kind of inner senses, you might say, maybe his astral sense. And then he wrote operas, and one of the kind of high notes of Barbara Streisand is also in the opera singers that sing in The Magic Flute, one of Mozart's kind of fun operas. And in The Magic Flute, the queen of the night, sings these really ultra high C notes, And it's really quite amazing. So indeed, that's probably part of the tapping into the Akashic level of sound that's emanating down and then able to affect, perhaps the heart, the cardiac plexus, their emotions, and then all these quantum microtubules have an influence of that Akashic force then into our physical Shula Sarira body, so that a person that's attuned to it, like Barbra Streisand, or the opera singers that are singing the Queen of the Night in the Magic Flute, are able to reach these high sounds.
Somebody have
And,
a question?
Then
I was
Trenton-
going to quickly make a note because you just mentioned something very important. Yes, indeed, HPV said that music and poetry are they are the highest. They go into the 6th level of consciousness.
Yes, thank you. And we have one more question here in the room, Trenton.
Yeah, so you had, you talked a lot about the different states of consciousness. So going back to that discussion, you also talked about how on this plane of consciousness or this plane of reality, physical plane, atoms or particles can be seen as particles or waves.
Yes.
And how differences in vibration can change different states of consciousness. So I'm wondering if there's a direct correlation between the levels of frequency or vibration and those different states of consciousness that you were talking about. That if the physical, what I see and perceive as physical reality, can be transcended into those higher states of consciousness just by an up or down tick in vibration. I'm wondering if there's a connection there.
I would say, yes, there is. And in the Secret Doctrine and in the biographies of Blavatsky, there some of these, I don't know what to call them, psychophysical phenomenon, like manifesting things like letters, bringing stuff out of nothing into concrete reality. So I would imagine that was a phenomenon of vibrations, of changing the vibration of things. But for me, the easiest and yet still complicated thing is to change the vibration of my mental function so that I can then be aware in dreams. And there's a guy in Stanford, Professor LaShawn, who talks about lucid dreaming. So again, it might be changing the frequency of your conscious awareness so that you have conscious, lucid awareness of your dreams. And then, of course, as we talk about the Turiya state, there'll be another change of your mental conscious awareness to then be at a higher vibrational energetic state, whether you can look at your dreams and look at this myopic Shula Sarira level of reality as if those things were just dreams. So yes, I would say that frequency and vibration and energy has something to do with it.
It should also be noted that people who go through NDE experiences, the near-death experiences, often state that what they're experiencing is far more inclusive of information and color and just more livable. I mean, it's more of a grander life than when they're in this body. In fact, I thought it was kind of funny because one NDE witness herself said, I didn't know how I was going to get back into that body because I felt so huge. That body just felt like a little cage almost.
Right. That's higher.
That's
being
so
the
much
true
information that they're capable of experiencing right now.
It's interesting you use the word color too, because I associate physical color is different rates of vibration.
Exactly.
So if you are experiencing there's so many more vibrations beyond just this physical plane. There is an association with color there too.
And people who experience prophetic dreams will have an extreme color vibration. Where versus that would even seem like upon waking, like this is nothing compared to what they were dreaming because the dream is so vivid. And it's almost like a Devacanic experience because that individual is almost within the action itself. So it can experience that color almost as a true experience, not just as an objective, I see you, but actually experience it.
That makes me think of, and I don't know if this is related because you talked about the 7 levels, and I don't know if those are related to the 7 chakras.
And remember, the 7 is an archetype. That just means that that's the basic pattern, but there are countless degrees of that archetype. So it's not,
Right,
it's
it's
just
not-
7 and that 7 is static. No.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
It just made me think of, well, different levels of frequency and vibration, and then color made me think of the 7 chakras. I don't know if those would be
Mhm.
related, because it just happens to be 7 too. But there again,
It's an archetype.
it's more of a spectrum than 7 distinct layers, right?
Mhm.
But is there a connection also with the chakra system and those, because those are technically levels of
Probably the
consciousness?
same thing. If you look at
I
the
don't know.
Sephiroth,
Yeah,
the Sephiroth is the same
know
thing
the
as the
Sephiroth.
chakras.
yeah,
So you're just basically taking that one pattern and grafting it onto just about
mhm,
everything in nature.
Mhm.
But of course, because it's fluid, because it's moving, and everything in nature moves, it has to have, it can go into countless degrees. It just follows a particular system.
mhm.
That system is it has to do with 7.
Okay.
It has to do with numbers and
My
triads
logical
and
brain has a trouble wrapping itself around it, because I mean, I've had some transcendental experiences where I feel that I've entered into that state of just seeing everything as vibration, and each vibration kind of had a different, almost geometrical
exactly.
pattern that went out, and it was breathing infinite whatever. But my logical brain still to this day does not understand that experience.
Right.
But it just reminds me of everything that you've been talking about and that experience. So it's all fascinating stuff. I'm brand new to theosophy, so pardon my ignorance on some of this stuff, but I'm very it's
Please don't
fascinating.
apologize.
It's fascinating.
And I
Thank
think
you.
one of the problems with science, if Ken can speak to it, is the fact that science thinks there is a void, and there really isn't. And I think that's one of the reasons why they got rid of the ether, because they said, well, nothing can exist in a void. Well, but there's no void. I mean, it all boils down to what we can see in that spectrum, and if we are not sensitive to everything outside of that very limited parameter, those limited parameters, then of course we're going to sense it as a void. But in fact, as HPB has said, in the secret doctrine, there's no such thing as a void.
Precisely, yes. So as a concluding remark, I would say that slowly, little by little, my esoteric science knowledge and vocabulary is catching up with my, Caltech Richard Feynman science and physics and biochemistry and all that kind of good stuff. And I'm optimistic, because even in that little paper, and I'm hoping, as Maluka said, there's so much stuff. I did pack a lot of stuff, I confess. But I was thinking it'll be recorded. You can watch it. You can pause it and look at the slides more in detail if you wish. But let me close out by saying thank you all for your attention, and also thank you for the opportunity to synthesize this stuff in my understanding as a student of theosophy. And turn the lectern here back to Jonathan to close us up for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Not everybody in the internet clapping.
That's right.
Okay, well, just as almost like the old British custom of a vote of thanks, I just wanted to state that this all actually started like 10 days ago or something like that
Wow.
in a text. And he responded back like in a nanosecond. Yeah, and his mind was totally full of what he was going to do. He's ready to go. And so that was just magnificent.
Yeah,
Everything that I had in mind, but way more. And it just really just filled out the whole idea of it. So, and I'm really impressed about how you've been able to bring together these two sets of nomenclatures, the two bilingual, bicameral, everything together, the spirit and matter, philosophy all together in one. So it's quite magnificent. So thank you very much. And next week we will, the coming force. We'll have to find out what that's about. Is that like Keeley or something, maybe? In the secret doctrine?
Yeah.
I don't know. But that'll be next week, and all are most welcome to come either online or in person. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah. Welcome.
Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste.
All right, thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye.
Hear you talk, your wisdom and knowledge, thank you so